For centuries, a Jewish community existed inside China that seemed almost impossible to explain. They spoke Chinese, wore Chinese clothing, used Chinese surnames, and lived thousands of kilometers from the ancient Jewish centers of the Middle East. Yet, in the city of Kaifeng, on the banks of the Yellow River, they maintained a synagogue, preserved Hebrew inscriptions, observed Jewish dietary traditions, and remembered themselves as part of the Jewish people. Then something extraordinary happened. The community slowly disappeared as a distinct institution. Not through one final massacre, not through one dramatic expulsion, but through generations of marriage, cultural assimilation, political change, and the gradual loss of Hebrew and Jewish religious knowledge. Their descendants remained, but the original community became difficult to see. For centuries, historians asked the same question: where did these Jews actually come from? Did they travel overland from Persia and Central Asia? Did they arrive by sea from India or Yemen? Were they connected to much older Jewish communities in China? Or had centuries of life in China transformed them so completely that their original ancestry was almost impossible to recover? Modern genetics has finally started answering part of that mystery, and the answer is not the simple story many people expect. The evidence points toward a Jewish community with deep connections to the wider Jewish diaspora, followed by substantial local Chinese admixture and a dramatic founder effect that preserved certain ancestral lines while other parts of the original genetic history disappeared. Recent genetic testing of documented Kaifeng paternal lineages has produced an especially surprising result. Some surviving lineages carry East Asian Y chromosome haplogroups, while other Kaifeng lineages show direct genetic matches with Jewish families from Bukhara and Kurdistan. The DNA does not reveal one pure bloodline. It reveals a journey. To understand that journey, we first have to separate history from legend. The Jews of Kaifeng are often described as China's oldest Jewish community, and scholars generally place the establishment of the community around the Song dynasty, although the exact arrival date remains debated. Kaifeng was one of the most important cities in China during the medieval period. It was a political capital, a commercial center, and a major point within networks connecting merchants from across Asia. Jewish merchants traveling through the Silk Road therefore had a realistic path into the city. Modern scholarship generally regards Persia as the most likely source region for the Kaifeng community, although scholars still debate the precise route. Some possibilities involve overland travel through Central Asia, while others involve maritime trade through India or the Indian Ocean. The important point is that Jewish migration into China did not have to happen in one dramatic journey from ancient Jerusalem. A family could move through several generations of diaspora communities before eventually reaching China. A merchant might have spent years in Persia, then Central Asia, then another trading city before settling in Kaifeng. By the time the community became established, its ancestors may already have carried ancestry from several different Jewish populations. That is why searching for one original Kaifeng Jew is unlikely to give us the complete answer. The community was created through movement, and movement produces layers. The documentary evidence from Kaifeng is remarkable. Jewish communities rarely leave behind such a clear combination of Chinese and Jewish material culture. Stone inscriptions from the Ming and Qing periods refer to a synagogue and describe Jewish beliefs and traditions. Visitors from Europe encountered Jews who were visibly integrated into Chinese society, but still maintained elements of Jewish religious practice. Their surnames were Chinese, their language was Chinese, and their daily lives were deeply shaped by Chinese customs. Yet they retained memories of Judaism. This combination eventually produced what scholars describe as Sino-Judaism, a form of Jewish life shaped strongly by Chinese social and cultural conditions. The community was never culturally identical to Jews living in Baghdad, Persia, or Europe. It had become something unique, and that uniqueness matters for genetics because culture and ancestry began moving in different directions. The community could remain Jewish in its self-understanding while absorbing local Chinese ancestry through marriage. Conversely, someone could inherit Jewish ancestry while losing their religious identity entirely. This is why DNA testing today is so difficult to interpret. Genetics measures biological inheritance. It does not measure faith. A descendant may carry Jewish ancestry but no longer practice Judaism, while another person may become Jewish through religious conversion without inheriting substantial ancestry from historical Jewish populations. Kaifeng is one of the clearest examples of why those categories must not be confused. The broader genetics of Jewish populations provides an important framework. Multiple genome-wide studies have shown that many Jewish diaspora populations share a substantial component of Near Eastern ancestry, while also carrying varying levels of ancestry from the populations around them. Ashkenazi Jews, Sephardi Jews, Iranian Jews, Iraqi Jews, North African Jews, and other communities are not genetically identical. They represent branches of a diaspora history shaped by migration and local admixture. Most retain some connection to ancient Levantine ancestry, but that connection exists alongside the genetic history of the regions in which the communities lived. The Kaifeng population should therefore not be expected to look exactly like any single modern Jewish community. If their founders arrived through Persia, they may have resembled Persian or Iraqi Jewish populations more closely than they resembled modern Europeans. After several centuries in China, however, their descendants would naturally accumulate local ancestry. This is not evidence against Jewish origins. It is precisely what population genetics predicts when a small migrant community settles in a new region and gradually intermarries with local people. The surprising part is not that Chinese ancestry entered the Kaifeng gene pool. The surprising part is that any evidence of the Jewish founders appears to have survived at all after so many generations. That brings us to the most interesting genetic findings available so far. In 2024, the Avatainu DNA Project announced preliminary results from an investigation involving 4 surviving paternal lineages with well-documented connections to Kaifeng Jewish families. The project used advanced next-generation sequencing on samples connected to men from these families. One Kaifeng lineage carried Y-DNA haplogroup OM175, a major East Asian paternal lineage that is common in East Asian populations and has no established Jewish-specific association in other communities. A second lineage appeared to belong to NM231, another paternal haplogroup strongly represented across northern Eurasia, although researchers said its precise connection to other Jewish groups remained under investigation. But 2 additional Kaifeng lineages produced what the researchers described as incontrovertible matches with individuals from historic Jewish communities in Bukhara and Kurdistan. This is a remarkable pattern. A single historic community contains paternal lines with clearly East Asian associations and other paternal lines connecting directly with Jewish populations farther west. This does not prove that the community was equally mixed in every family, and it does not give us an overall Jewish ancestry percentage. But it provides exactly the kind of evidence historians needed. Some Kaifeng family lines preserve a measurable connection with the broader Jewish diaspora, while others show the impact of life inside China. Because these findings were presented as preliminary and are still undergoing the full peer review process, they should not be treated as the final word. But they offer perhaps the most intriguing genetic clue yet about the community's origins. The most important thing about these results is what they tell us about the word lineage. A population does not need one genetic signature to have a common history. Imagine a group of Jewish merchants arriving in China. One group of men comes from a community in Central Asia. Another group arrives from Persia. Some marry local Chinese women. Their children marry other members of the community. Still later, additional Chinese families became incorporated. Over centuries, different ancestral lines rise and fall in frequency. Some paternal lineages disappear, others expand. A few survive because their descendants become numerous. The result can be genetically diverse, even though the community shares a common cultural origin. This may be exactly what happened in Kaifeng. The current preliminary data suggests that the historic population could have been more genetically heterogeneous than the idea of one single founding migration implies. The community may have developed through several migration episodes, or through a smaller founding population that later absorbed local ancestry and maintained only a few surviving paternal lines. Without large whole genome datasets, scientists cannot yet distinguish all of these possibilities. But that uncertainty is not a failure. It is the scientific reality of studying a community whose population structure changed dramatically before geneticists arrived. The maternal side of the story is even harder to reconstruct. Mitochondrial DNA passes from mothers to children, so maternal lineages can reveal whether migrant men and local women contributed differently to a community. This is often extremely important in diaspora populations because the first generation of migrants can leave an uneven genetic footprint. Imagine a small group of Jewish men arriving in China and marrying local women. Their sons may preserve Jewish-associated Y chromosomes, while their children's mitochondrial DNA comes from Chinese mothers. After several generations, the population could therefore look very different, depending on whether scientists examine the Y chromosome or mitochondrial DNA. The autosomal genome would contain a mixture of both. This is why researchers need all 3 systems to reconstruct the history properly. A Y chromosome tells one paternal line. Mitochondrial DNA tells one maternal line. Autosomal DNA integrates ancestry from thousands of ancestors. A single marker can reveal an important clue, but it cannot tell the complete story. For Kaifeng, this is particularly important because the known sample sizes remain small. The community needs much larger, carefully documented genetic studies before scientists can confidently estimate the relative contributions of Jewish founders and local Chinese populations. There is, however, another genetic discovery that makes the broader Silk Road story even more fascinating. Researchers, examining more than 55,000 Eurasian mitochondrial DNA samples, found several Eastern Eurasian mitochondrial lineages among Jewish populations, including NIA-A and M33C. One particular founder lineage, M33C2, was estimated to have entered an Eastern Ashkenazi Jewish population roughly 1,400 years ago. The researchers argued that this timing fits the historical period of extensive Silk Road communication between Jewish communities in the Far East. This does not prove that Kaifeng Jews originated from China. It demonstrates something broader and more important. Jewish populations and East Asian populations were exchanging genes as well as goods and ideas. The Silk Road was a biological network as well as a commercial one. Merchants traveled with families, local marriages occurred. Children inherited DNA from both worlds. These exchanges could happen even when communities remained culturally distinct. The finding makes the idea of a Jewish community developing in China much less mysterious. Long-distance contact between Jews and East Asians was already biologically possible long before modern geneticists began looking for the evidence. But there is another side to the story that could easily be overlooked. Genetic evidence connecting a Kaifeng family line to Bukhara or Kurdistan does not prove that the entire Jewish community originated in those places. A shared Y chromosome can indicate a common paternal ancestor, but that ancestor may have lived centuries before the communities became established in their final locations. Likewise, an East Asian haplogroup in a Kaifeng family does not automatically mean that the family entered the Jewish community from outside. It could reflect local male ancestry incorporated at some point in the community's history. It could also represent a lineage acquired several centuries after the community's founding. Genetics can tell us that lineages are related. Historical dating and genealogy are required to determine when that relationship became part of a specific community. This is why serious genetic genealogy avoids statements such as, "This haplogroup proves your people came from China." Instead, researchers ask how widespread the lineage is, how old it is, which populations share it, and whether the genetic pattern matches documentary evidence. Kaifeng is a perfect example of why those questions matter. The community's gradual assimilation also explains why the genetic signal may be much weaker than people expect. Consider what happens after 10, 20, or 30 generations. Every generation reshuffles the genome through recombination. A specific ancestor's autosomal DNA can be reduced to small fragments or disappear entirely from a descendant's genome. This means a person can genuinely descend from Jewish founders 500 or 1,000 years ago and still have no easily detectable Jewish percentage in a commercial DNA test. The reverse is also true. A person's genetic profile may contain a segment that resembles Jewish reference populations without proving that the segment came from a Jewish ancestor. The Mediterranean and Eurasian world has been interconnected for thousands of years. Genetic segments can move between populations through many historical routes. That is why a DNA test should never be treated as a simple historical certificate. The strongest evidence comes when genetic connections, family records, community histories, and geographical context all point toward the same explanation. The story of the Kaifeng surnames shows exactly how cultural identity can survive while genetic ancestry changes. During the Ming period, the Jewish community became associated with a small set of Chinese surnames, traditionally including Ai, Shi, Gao, Gan, Jin, Li, Zhang, and Zhao. To a modern observer, these names look completely Chinese. There's nothing immediately Jewish about them. Yet the community remembered them as part of its history. Over time, those surnames became indistinguishable from ordinary Chinese family names, especially as descendants intermarried and the synagogue community declined. This is an extraordinary example of cultural transformation. A family can retain a memory of Jewish ancestry even after its surname becomes Chinese. The name survives, but its original context becomes invisible. Genetics may therefore become one of the few tools capable of recovering pieces of a history that the naming system no longer reveals. The decline of the Kaifeng Jewish community happened gradually. Jewish institutions weakened, Hebrew literacy disappeared, religious practices became harder to maintain, intermarriage increased. By the 19th century, the community had largely assimilated into surrounding Chinese society. What makes this different from many Jewish communities in Europe is the absence of a nearby network of synagogues and Jewish centers capable of continually reinforcing identity. A community isolated geographically from the rest of the Jewish world has fewer opportunities to bring in rabbis, teachers, marriage partners, religious texts, and new migrants. Over generations, this isolation can produce a population that is culturally Chinese while retaining memories of Jewish ancestry. The genetic consequence is equally profound. Once endogamy weakens, local ancestry enters more rapidly, and old founder lineages become diluted across the population. Some survive only through particular families. Others disappear completely. This may explain why modern descendants of Kaifeng Jews show such different genetic clues. And that difference is important because there is no single Kaifeng DNA. A family descended from one founder may preserve a paternal Jewish lineage. Another may preserve an East Asian paternal lineage. A third may have little distinctive DNA left at all, but may possess strong documentary evidence of Jewish descent. This is the reality of a 1,000-year-old community that experienced assimilation. Genetic ancestry becomes fragmented, identity becomes complicated, family stories become essential. The community itself stops functioning as a clean genetic unit. This means the genetic reconstruction of Kaifeng Jews cannot rely on a handful of famous surnames or one commercial ancestry test. Researchers need genealogically documented families, large sample sizes, and whole genome comparison with Jewish populations across Asia and the Middle East. The wider Jewish diaspora gives us a model for what might have happened. Genome-wide studies of Jewish populations have shown that most communities share a strong Near Eastern ancestral component while also carrying local ancestry. The exact mixture varies widely. Ethiopian Jews cluster primarily with neighboring Ethiopian populations. Indian Jews cluster strongly with populations of Western India. Other diaspora communities show stronger connections with Middle Eastern ancestry. This demonstrates that Jewish identity can survive under very different genetic conditions. A community may remain Jewish while incorporating substantial local ancestry. Another may remain more genetically similar to other Jewish populations, because endogamy is stronger. Kaifeng may represent one of the most extreme examples of this process because its geographic distance from the Middle Eastern and European Jewish world was so enormous and its period of isolation lasted so long. The comparison with Indian Jews is particularly useful. Researchers studying the Bene Israel and Koshin Jews found that their genomes cluster strongly with neighboring Indian populations, despite clear historical and paternal connections to the Levant in the Bene Israel case. This tells us that a Jewish community can preserve a historical Jewish origin while becoming genetically integrated into its surrounding population. The Kaifeng story appears to fit the same general principle, although the available data are far more limited. If future genome-wide research demonstrates substantial Chinese ancestry combined with specific shared segments connecting Kaifeng descendants to established Jewish communities in Central Asia and the Middle East, it would provide a powerful parallel. The community would then represent not a mystery of impossible origins, but a textbook example of diaspora, adaptation, and admixture. The most exciting future research may therefore come from ancient DNA, rather than modern descendants alone. Imagine if scientists discovered a Jewish cemetery in Kaifeng or another early Chinese settlement containing remains that can be securely dated to the Song dynasty. If those skeletons could be sequenced, researchers could compare them directly with modern descendants. They could ask whether the paternal lines identified in the modern Avitainu study were already present in the medieval community. They could measure how much Chinese ancestry had entered the population by that time. They could compare Kaifeng genomes with Jewish populations in Persia, Iraq, Bukhara, and Kurdistan. That would move the debate from speculation toward direct evidence. Instead of asking which modern population looks most similar to Kaifeng Jews, scientists could examine the people who actually lived in Kaifeng hundreds of years ago. Ancient DNA could therefore provide the missing link between historical records and modern descendants. There is also a broader historical lesson here. The Jewish community of Kaifeng is often presented as proof that Jews were secretly living in China for thousands of years, but the exact timing is more complicated. Most scholars place the established community in the Song period, not necessarily thousands of years earlier. Some traditions suggest older arrivals, but documentary evidence is limited. The responsible scientific position is therefore to distinguish between what is well established and what remains possible. Jewish merchants were present in China by the medieval period. A significant Jewish community existed in Kaifeng. It maintained recognizable Jewish traditions. It gradually assimilated. Modern descendants preserve some family traditions and genetic lineages. Those facts are strong. The idea that one ancient migration during biblical times created the entire community remains unproven. Precision does not make the story less exciting. It makes it more credible. So, what have scientists actually revealed about the genetic origins of China's Jews? They have not found a single ancient genome labeled Kaifeng Jew. They have not discovered a secret gene that identifies Jewish identity. They have not proved that every descendant of the community is genetically Middle Eastern. What they have found is more interesting. Some surviving Kaifeng paternal lines connect directly with historic Jewish communities from Bukhara and Kurdistan. Other tested paternal lines carry East Asian Y chromosome haplogroups. The community therefore preserves both Jewish-associated and Chinese-associated genetic histories. That pattern fits a diaspora population that arrived through long-distance trade, established itself in China, and gradually absorbed local ancestry. The evidence also fits the broader history of Jewish populations, where Near Eastern ancestry was repeatedly combined with local ancestry as communities moved across the world. And the strongest clue of all may be the community's survival itself. Because genetics did not discover a hidden civilization. It discovered fragments of families, fragments of migrations, fragments of ancestry. The original community is gone as a unified institution, but pieces of it survive in Chinese surnames, in family traditions, in historical inscriptions, and now, increasingly, in DNA. Imagine a merchant arriving in Kaifeng centuries ago. He has traveled farther than almost anyone in his family history. He enters a city at the center of a civilization with customs completely different from those of the Jewish world he left behind. His children grow up speaking Chinese. His grandchildren marry into families that may be partly local. 100 years becomes 200. 200 becomes 500. The synagogue still stands, then disappears. Hebrew is remembered, then forgotten. The family surname becomes ordinary. Eventually, descendants may have no idea what their ancestors looked like, where they were born, or why certain traditions existed. But their DNA still carries the journey. One chromosome may point west, another line may point east. One family may carry a Jewish-associated paternal lineage, another may carry an East Asian lineage, and the autosomal genome may contain a mixture of both. That is not a contradiction. That is history. The genetic origins of China's Jews were not one clean migration. They were a process. A Jewish diaspora moved into China. Chinese society shaped them. Local ancestry entered the community. The community adapted. Its institutions weakened. Its identity is fragmented. But some genetic traces remained, and centuries later, scientists found them. The mystery, therefore, has an answer, but not the kind of answer a dramatic headline usually promises. China's Jews were not a genetically frozen population from the ancient Near East. They were not simply Chinese converts either. They were a diaspora community whose Jewish founders became part of Chinese society while preserving pieces of their older ancestry. Some of those pieces survived, in particular paternal families. Others disappeared. Some were replaced through intermarriage. And some may still be waiting to be discovered in the genomes of descendants who do not even realize what their DNA contains.